Meet George, a grumpy old man with a heart of gold. His perch is a weather-worn porch, a steadfast island amidst the ever-changing seas of his neighborhood. His arms are crossed, his brows furrowed, and his eyes squinting at the world that bustles by, louder and busier with each passing day. "Darn kids and their noisy contraptions," he mutters, shaking his head in disapproval. "In my day, we knew how to appreciate some peace and quiet." For years, George's days have been woven into the fabric of this tight-knit community. But lately, even this tranquil corner of the world has been stirred by winds of change that George finds as unwelcome as a cold gust on a warm day. Particularly irksome are the new arrivals, the Pattersons, a family that's brought a whirlwind of chaos and noise in their wake. As George broods over the days of yore, his solitaire is interrupted by a voice as bright as sunshine. It's his 12-year-old granddaughter Susan who bounds up the porch steps, eyes sparkling with the thrill of a secret. "Gramps, I've got some news for you," she announces, bubbling with excitement. "What is it now, Susan?" George grumbles, his voice gruff, his demeanor unchanged. Her tale is of a mystery, of garden gnomes gone missing from the Pattersons' yard and a cryptic note left in their stead. George scoffs at the mention of the gnomes, but when Susan mentions the note demanding a valuable exchange for their return, intrigue creeps into George's grumpy exterior. "Well, I suppose I could help her find those gnomes. After all, I used to be a detective in my prime," he muses, the corners of his mouth twitching upwards in a rare smile. His claim is met with a playful roll of Susan's eyes. "Gramps, you were never a detective." With a grumble and a chuckle, George concedes. But as the sun sets on the porch, the stage is set for a grand adventure. And unbeknownst to George, this mystery might just be the key to unlock a friendship he never expected. "In my day, we knew how to appreciate some peace and quiet," George repeats, a soft smile playing on his lips. His adventure has just begun. Suddenly, George's quiet afternoon is interrupted by a burst of energy. A youthful whirlwind named Susan, George's 12-year-old granddaughter, bounds up the porch steps, her eyes sparkling with a secret she can't wait to share. Susan is George's polar opposite, a bright and chipper ray of sunshine to his grumpy cloud. But there's a bond between them that's as strong as it is unlikely. With a wide grin, Susan blurts out her exciting news. "Gramps, Mrs. Patterson's garden gnomes have vanished." Her words tumble out in a rush, filled with the intrigue of a true mystery. George, ever the grump, dismisses the gnomes as merely silly things. But Susan's not finished. She tells of a mysterious note left behind, promising the return of the gnomes for something valuable. Now, despite his gruff exterior, George can't help but be drawn in. "Well, I suppose I could help her find those gnomes. After all, I used to be a detective in my prime." Despite his gruff exterior, George finds himself intrigued by the mystery. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, George and Susan set off on their adventure. The neighborhood, once familiar and predictable, suddenly seemed shrouded in mystery and intrigue. The rustling of the leaves, the creaking of the old oak tree, everything seemed to whisper secrets. Walking side by side, their footsteps echoed on the cobblestone path. Susan, with her notebook in hand, was bubbling with excitement, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of the chase. George, on the other hand, wore a look of concentration, his mind ticking over the details of the strange case. Their first stop was Mrs. Patterson's house. The garden, once adorned with an array of colorful gnomes, now seemed oddly empty. They examined the cryptic note left on the doorstep, its words hinting at a playful mischief rather than malicious intent. George found himself drawn into the mystery, his curiosity piqued. He started asking questions, his tone no longer gruff but filled with genuine concern. Mrs. Patterson, surprised by this unexpected kindness, began to see George in a new light. As the days rolled into nights, George and Susan were seen together more often, their unlikely partnership causing a stir in the neighborhood. They interviewed other neighbors, inspected the gnomeless gardens, and even had a late-night stakeout, fortified with Susan's homemade cookies and thermos flasks of hot cocoa. In the midst of this adventure, something remarkable was happening. The grumpy exterior of George was slowly melting away. He found himself laughing at Susan's jokes, sharing stories from his past, and even enjoying Mrs. Patterson's company. As they walked home one evening, their laughter filled the quiet street. They were no longer just a grumpy old man and an enthusiastic young girl. They were partners in crime-solving, companions united by a shared mission. They laughed, they argued, and they discovered that beneath their differences, they shared a deep appreciation for the simpler joys of life. Their adventure was just beginning, a tale of friendship, mystery, and garden gnomes woven into the fabric of the quiet neighborhood. As they delve deeper into the gnome napping case, George finds his grumpy exterior softening. Their adventure takes them from one neighbor's yard to another, each walkthrough revealing a new clue, a new piece of the puzzle. George and Susan, the unlikely duo, find themselves knee-deep in gnome napping shenanigans. As they move closer to the gnome napper's identity, George can't help but notice a change in himself. The grumbles that usually color his day seem to fade into the background, replaced by an excitement he hasn't felt in years. His granddaughter's infectious enthusiasm, the thrill of the chase, and the camaraderie of their shared mission, all of it chips away at his gruff exterior. He finds himself laughing more, grumbling less. George's reflections take him back to his youth, to a time when the world was simpler, less noisy. But he realizes, as he shares this adventure with his granddaughter, that the world hasn't gotten worse, it has just changed. And maybe, just maybe, he can change with it. Every clue they uncover, every lead they follow, brings him closer to the Pattersons, his new neighbors. He begins to understand them, to appreciate their energy and warmth. He finds himself forming an unlikely friendship with Mrs. Patterson, a woman he'd initially dismissed as part of the noisy new world he disliked. And in this unexpected friendship, George discovers a shared love for the quieter, simpler joys of life. He finds that beneath the surface, beneath the noise and the change, there's a common thread that ties them all together. A love for peace, for community, for a good old-fashioned mystery. As George and Susan close in on the gnome napper, George can't help but reflect on his journey. He realizes that even an old grump like him can adapt, can find joy in the unlikeliest of places, and can connect with the world in new ways. Perhaps the changing world wasn't so bad after all. As they unravel the mystery, George finds himself looking forward to more adventures, more mysteries, and more opportunities to connect with the world around him. As the first chapter of Grumpy George's Chronicles comes to a close, George realizes a valuable lesson. In the quiet neighborhood where George had spent most of his life, things were changing. The arrival of the Pattersons, with their whirlwind of energy, had initially been a source of irritation for our grumpy protagonist. Their missing garden gnomes, however, had set off an unexpected chain of events. George and his young granddaughter Susan embarked on a journey to solve the mystery of the missing gnomes. The curmudgeonly old man, who often found himself reminiscing about the good old days, found himself embroiled in an adventure right on his doorstep. And as they followed the trail of clues, questioned their neighbors, and pieced together the puzzle, something began to change in George. Throughout the adventure, George found himself growing closer to the Pattersons, particularly Mrs. Patterson. This was a surprise even to him. Underneath their different exteriors, they discovered a shared love for the simple joys of life. Who would have thought that beneath his gruff demeanor, George had room for new friendships? The lesson George learned was a profound one. He realized that change isn't always a bad thing. In fact, it can open up new opportunities, new friendships, and even new adventures. It taught him that even in his golden years, life still had surprises in store for him. He found joy and connection in the most unlikely of places and situations. In the end, as George sat on his porch, sharing a cup of tea with his new friend and his granddaughter, he couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. Yes, the world was changing, but maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. And so, as we leave George to enjoy his newfound peace, we can't help but look forward to the next chapter of his life. What other adventures and life lessons await him in the future? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to follow Grumpy George's Chronicles.